Let's talk about the WPA2 four-way handshake. Now, most of us are still using WPA2 for our security. There is a WPA3 out there, but WPA2 is still dominant. When two devices need to communicate with each other, such as the router and the computer, for example, or the router and a phone, they have to create a session. They have to establish a session with each other. And during that establishment of the session, they have to prove that each other knows the password. But they don't want to send the password to each other or even a hash of the password to each other. And so they have a way of getting around that. Now, the password is what you have put on that device. So, for example, on your wireless router, you put the password for my SSID is banana, right? You put that in there. And then you put that on your laptop. You go into your laptop and say, okay, I want to connect to this particular SSID, and the password is banana. So now both devices know that that's the password. That's, by the way, what we call symmetric encryption. There's also an asymmetric encryption. We're not going to get into that right now. Now, we don't want to share that, and we don't want to share the hash of that password. What we want to do is create a brand new key that is a temporary key, a one-time, a one-session key. And so that's what part of these 4 steps is all about. We're going to take the PMK, or the pairwise master key, that is banana right there, and we're going to create a session key called the pairwise transient key. So this is the temporary key that's only good, only valid for this session. And the way that it's doing that is, in general, I'm not going to try to go step by step through the process and map it out because it would take a long time, but the access point generates a random number called a nonce, and then the computer generates another nonce. That one's an A nonce, and this one's an S nonce, and it sends that back to the other computer, or to the router, I mean. Now, the two devices are going to use the word banana that they already know and the nonce to create this temporary transient key. Now, again, I'm not going to go through step by step, but by the end of this thing, they have created this transient key, or this temporary password. And that is what they will use for that session, so that somebody can't come along and reproduce that session, because when they try to log into a new session, it requires a brand new key, and they don't have the word banana that they use to make that new key. So that's the basics of how this works. I hope that's a little bit helpful. All right, let's move on now to autonomous and thin wireless access points. Again, this was a little bit tricky to read in the book, so let me just try to pare it down to its basics. An autonomous access point is one where each access point is configured independently. So in other words, a company has a router, and they have an Ethernet router, and they buy a bunch of these access points, but they have to go to each access point and individually configure it. A thin access point, these are all configured at the same time through a centralized controller. Usually that centralized controller is some online subscription service that they have to pay for. So that's the only way to configure all of those points. However, they only have to do it once, and they're all the same for if they have 100 of these things or even 50 of these things. They don't want to go to all 50 of them. Somebody's going to make a mistake if they try to do them one at a time anyway. So they pay for this service so that they can now configure all of these things all at once. That's a thin access point. That is the main difference between them. All right, let's take up this one, and I forgot to make that a heading. Integration and distribution services. These are confusing terms, again, confusing descriptions in the book that I want to help you understand by first of all telling you something that they did not tell you in the book. These are services that run on the wireless access point. So they are software running on the wireless access point. The integration service software is just ensuring that the wireless devices can join the network and interact with wired devices, whereas the distribution services are handling the actual movement of data between devices, ensuring that all the communication is flowing smoothly. So there's not much you can do with these in a practical sense, but it's just a good thing to know these terms and understand them when you run across them, or for quiz and test purposes perhaps. And so that's the difference between these services, and that's where they run in the network. All right, we'll take up the wireless bridges next time.